Okay, well, hello again, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, this is going to be a whistle-stop tour, probably between 45 minutes and 1 hour, to explore the PERMAH model and character strengths. My name, Jamie Emberson. I'm the founder and director of the Academy of Awareness and Wellbeing. I'm the director of Wellbeing at Changing Lives, Building Dreams, based in Kent, and I'm also a Studio 3 consultant. Relatively, jumping straight in, relatively and comparatively, the sort of subject of wellbeing itself, certainly as far as psychology is relatively new, certainly as far as the founder, Marty Seligman. But if we look at the pillars, we can see that whilst the terminology of PERMAH, which we'll be exploring slightly deeper a bit later, it really isn't that new. If you look at the foundations, we go back to the 18th and 20th century. And indeed, even further back than that, when we look at ancient origins, we have, sort of Socrates and Aristotle, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other wisdom traditions that acknowledged sort of well-being. But it wasn't really until sort of the World Health Organization, I think back in the sort of 40s and 50s, really started to look at it more seriously. But, interestingly, from a contemporary perspective, sort of the PERMAH model is really, once again, by comparison, very new. In fact, we're sort of talking about sort of the year 2000, 2002, 2003. Now, of course, some of you may have noticed that on the information about this presentation, it's PERMAH, so it's got an H on the end. To briefly just look at that, so what we've done is we've extended the PERMAH of PERMAH with an H, and that is simply, and I say we, in fact, it was Michelle McQuaid, and I've put her contact details there. H is simply for health. So as well as, and again, we will be going in more detail about the PERMAH model, but as well as positive emotions, engagement and flow, relationships, meaning and accomplishment, we're also looking at health. So this is a very sort of holistic model that we're looking at, and by health, obviously diet, exercise and sleep, but also any other element of sort of health as it relates to humankind. I'd like to put a bit of context behind PERMAH, and I'd really like to go back to Marty Seligman's earlier work, who sort of a psychologist at least, but a profound thinker and an elder in our times, really. He's an academic, he's a philosopher, but he's also sort of very pragmatic. And his original theory of well-being was in fact happiness. And of course, when we look at sort of happiness, and this was his first publication, titled Authentic Happiness, Seligman believed that well-being was achieved through happiness. And when we talk about happiness, we can define it in two elements, sort of hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. However, early in the 2001, 2002, it would have been 2002, at the first inaugural Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, he was politely challenged, and as Marty Seligman reports himself, he was sort of challenged by the statement that, you know, Marty, your 2002 theory can't be right. It omits success and mastery, which of course happiness might not necessarily be completely fulfilled by that. So he began to sort of rethink happiness in the context of well-being. And rolling forward sort of a couple of years, he then published, and this is the cover of the other book, he published Flourish. And here Martin Seligman kind of changed his mind from a perspective that he looked at well-being as a construct, and well-being, not happiness, that is the topic of positive psychology. And well-being has 5 elements, which is the PERMAH: positive emotions, engagement and flow, relationships, meaning and purpose, and accomplishment and achievement. And each of these elements contributes to defining well-being, but none defines well-being in itself. Some are measured subjectively and some are measured objectively. I suppose the first question to ask, given the title of the book is Flourish, is, you know, what is flourishing? And in the book Flourish, Martin Seligman draws a distinction between a measure of flourishing, and here we have, as you'll see, core features and additional features. And in order for somebody to be considered to be flourishing in their life, an individual must have all of the core features, being positive emotions, engagement, interest, meaning, purpose, and 3 of the additional features to flourish: self-esteem, optimism, resilience, vitality, self-determination, and positive relationships. Of course, they could have all of those if they were really very lucky. And it's this focus of flourishing that is distinctive within sort of positive psychology, and certainly positive psychology interventions, because it's the starting point. So where do character strengths fit in? We have the 5 pillars. In fact, we have 6 because we've got the H on it, which is health. So where do the character strengths fit in? Well, again, early 2000, Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman were asked to undertake a study. And it was I believe it was a 3-year study. And they brought together 52 or 53 very eminent sort of scientists, including psychologists and so on. And they wanted to know a simple question, but of course, going about the answer wasn't that simple. But they wanted to know what was good and positive in human beings and across the world. So not just related to a specific country or a specific culture. And these 52 or 53 scientists undertook studies. They undertook literature research going back sort of 2,500 years. They interviewed leaders in our communities, religious leaders, but also business leaders, people that were eminent within their society. Robert Biswas-Diener, a well-known professional in our field, also travelled to remote areas, including interviewing Maasai warriors, the Inuit Indians in North America. And over a period of these several years, what they were able to establish was 6 virtues and 24 character strengths. And character strengths are capacities for thinking, so cognitions, feeling, emotions, and behaving, behavior and actions. And the text that we've got up here defines and goes into the classification of each of the virtues and each of the 24 character strengths. To take a brief look, here are the character strengths. And on the left-hand side, in the darker blue, we have the virtues. And the virtues being wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. And next to each of those, we have the corresponding character strengths. We don't have time to go through all of them, but just to mention that this PowerPoint presentation will be available after this talk. Also, you'll notice there is a website, viacharacter.org. And if you go onto that website, you can actually register for free, and you can take what's known as the Character Strengths Inventory, which is the only free psychometric validated of its type. I use this myself, both within the context of as a coach, but also with teams and also people with learning disabilities and autism, developmental disorder, or both. So once we've kind of got the results that breaks down our 24 character strengths, very briefly, it breaks them down into something called signature strengths, which typically are the first 5 or 6 top character strengths. And signature strengths are referred to, as the name would suggest, the signature is that they are so individual to you. They are the, let's say, the real authentic you. And they're character strengths that you can use without really having to think about it. It comes really naturally. And they're also signature strengths because, you know, if you didn't have them or you was prevented from using them, that would be very likely to cause you an emotional reaction and distress. In the centre of the 24, those are referred to as middle strengths. And those are strengths that are all strengths. So this is an all positive survey. And the middle strengths are strengths that are ones that, yes, you use, but you might have to think about using them. They might not come so naturally. And then the lower strengths, so they're not weaknesses, but the lower strengths are character strengths that they may have got a bit lost, or you may use them very infrequently. So once we've got them, what kind of might we do to try to put these into the context of well-being and the PERMAH model? I think it's worth mentioning that Marty Seligman and his colleagues refer to character strengths as one of the possible pathways to attaining the PERMAH model and a flourishing life. So these are kind of tools that we can use. So what might we be able to do with these sort of character strengths, and what might we be able to do to increase people to have more of a flourishing life? Well, I like simple, although we will be moving on to more structured, scientific and evidence-based. But I think it's a very good start. And I'm taking for granted that whoever we work with, and including ourselves and our friends and colleagues and so on, that we've got good relationships, because once again, and I think this has been mentioned throughout the conferences and webinars, it all really does hinge on relationships. And if we know people well enough, and as you can see here, you know, I've kind of put a simple approach over a cup of tea, etc. When we talk about positive emotions, and I've put this little table, if it's like we're asking these questions about ourselves, but obviously we could be asking it about other people. When we talk about positive emotions, what is it that provides us with positive emotions? So what is it that provides you with positive emotions? What gives you that feel-good factor? What is it that when you wake up in the morning, you wake up looking forward to the day? What is it that on going through that day, you kind of really feel that you've got that real good gut feeling, and you're having those positive emotions? The same for the engagement. You know, what is it that really gets me engaged? What do I really enjoy doing? Where do I lose a sense of time? Where do I get totally absorbed in what I'm doing? So for me, perhaps that in fact might be music or walking. And what we're talking about here is the state of flow. So what is it that gets me into this state of flow? Relationships. You know, what relationships are important to me or the person that is we're trying to support or help. Meaning. What gives me meaning and purpose? What is it that actually gives me that feeling that I've got something bigger than just myself? I'm part of something bigger. So for me, for example, being part of CLBD, Studio 3, I'm part of something bigger than just me, and that gives me purpose and it gives me meaning. Achievement and accomplishment. What do I want to achieve? You know, what are the personal and professional aspirations that I want to work towards? And obviously on the H, being health, what would make me healthier? Not that one can't sometimes overindulge and have those cakes and biscuits, but what would make me healthier as a person? And again, looking at particularly exercise, which we know reduces the stress hormone cortisol, sleep and diet. So in a sense, this is a very informal approach where we're at just right now. It's a very informal approach, but it's one that I think if we know people well enough and we're able to have this discussion, we could really come up with some very meaningful action plans. And I think that's important. You know, it's okay to have the discussions and become aware, but we must action it. And I'm a little bit specific on that. So, you know, if I was having this discussion, I would want to know, you know, what are the actions we're going to talk about exactly, who does what, how, by when, how do we measure it, and how is it evidenced? Just a simple framework. We then are able to move on to more structured and scientific and evidence-based procedures. Excuse me. And here is whereby we can adopt our information about character strengths with a view to attaining PERMAH in, for example, the use of coaching. We can use systemic and organisational approaches, meetings, workshops, policies and practice. We can use character strengths within practice leadership. We can provide, and we are in fact currently providing, PERMAH wellbeing coach training. We're developing a PERMAH wellbeing plan. And when I say that we're developing these and we're providing it, we're looking at this as we're all in this together. So it's not just specifically for people that may have a learning disability or autistic developmental disorder. Because, you know, the subject of well-being and the pathway that we can use character strengths to attain well-being and flourishing is important to each and every one of us. We can use it in supervisions, in our leadership style, and also in debriefs following certain critical incidents that sometimes are unavoidable in our work. So what we're really doing is we're integrating awareness and the language of PERMAH and character strengths to develop character strengths to attain the dimensions of PERMAH and hopefully result in a more flourishing life. More structured, scientific and evidence-based is Ryan Nemec, who is the educational director of the Via Character organisation that I mentioned earlier. Here, within character strength interventions, Ryan and his colleagues have developed 70 plus character strength positive psychology interventions, whereby we can increase, or in some cases decrease, the use of character strengths, both contextually but also situationally. One of those may be strength spotting, which is a researched character strength positive psychology intervention. And strength spotting is whereby you would provide somebody with feedback on their character strengths that you've actually observed, and then you would not only name it, but you would explain why you'd seen it and what that person was doing. And we know through the evidence that increases the person's positive emotion because they're receiving positive feedback. And it's also correlated with some of the other dimensions of the PERMAH. There's another practice or positive psychology intervention using a signature strength in a new way. And this was a gold standard study that was undertaken. Information is within both of these books, but this was a gold standard study that was undertaken. And some of the findings on this were quite extraordinary. People that were supported to use their signature strengths in a new way for a relatively brief period had less depression, they had an increase in positive emotion and some of the other dimensions of PERMAH. Most astoundingly, some of these results extended for 6 months after this particular intervention. As I mentioned, there's kind of 70 plus character strength interventions in this book. There's also plenty of others because there's also other resources out there too. But this is certainly one resource that I can recommend. Ryan Nemec also produced mindfulness and character strengths. And this relates obviously to the use of mindfulness. And for those of you that observed and tuned into last week's session with Dean Donalds, he gave a wonderful session on mindfulness last week. And hopefully we may have an opportunity to do an integrated practice of both mindfulness and character strengths at the end of this presentation before we close. But briefly, just to give you some background to what's referred to as the mindfulness-based strengths practices program, which is mindfulness and character strengths. It's an 8-week course, like many of the mindfulness courses, and the basic message around the integration of mindfulness with character strengths is that mindfulness itself strengthens character strengths, and character strengths also strengthens mindfulness. That they're independent, but they are interconnected. What I really like about the mindfulness-based strengths practices program is that it's very in keeping with the sort of well-being model and the positive psychology model. I also trained to do MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and mindfulness-based stress reduction, and both, you know, absolutely terrific courses. And people that undertake that, the evidence is that many people really do benefit. However, and I'm not criticising MBCT or MBSR, but that they are disease medical model led from a point of view that, you know, to want to do an MBCT program or a cognitive therapy or a mindfulness-based strengths reduction course, you've got to be wanting to fix a problem. You've either got to be suffering, you know, for example, from stress, and you know, once again, this isn't a criticism. As reported with both the MBCT and MBSR, there are subsequent positive benefits that enhance well-being in any case. But what's interesting is that with the mindfulness-based strengths practices, it includes the setting out with a view of increasing flourishing. So this makes it very but it doesn't mean that you don't, and we'll touch upon this later, it doesn't mean that you don't address issues of concern, but it isn't the starting point. The starting point of this particular positive psychology intervention and program is to increase flourishing. And it's strengths based. I'd like to throw in here just a little sort of myth buster. Rightly so, I think in the early days, positive psychology received quite a lot of criticism, and you know, fair in that too. Critical thinking and judgment can often result in progress. But just to make clear that positive psychology, and certainly in the context of PERMAH and character strengths, it's not just about the happy clappy and all that's going right. It's also about confronting issues and concerns. And as I mentioned, it's just that might not necessarily be the starting point. And it's kind of interesting that there is an interrelationship. I mentioned just a little bit down that there's a sort of a dialectic relationship, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. But I rather like a couple of things. Dean mentioned something, the chap that did the webinar on mindfulness last week. he mentioned to me in the same sort of context about a lotus flower. And again, you know, this is kind of integrating and acknowledging the interconnectedness between the positive and the less positive, or the positive and concerns. See, you can't have a lotus flower without all the mud. If you haven't got the mud, you don't get the lotus. And the Vietnamese monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, he mentions about toothache. And he kind of rather humorously says that, you know, in order to appreciate not having a toothache, you must have suffered from one. Because if you've never had a toothache, you wouldn't appreciate not having one. So there is this dialectic relationship and an interconnectedness and interdependence between what's going right and concerns. And once again, we're all in this together, aren't we? None of us have a life where everything just goes to plan and everything's all fine. And hopefully none of us have a life where nothing goes to plan and everything's always awful. But there is a balance. We almost, you know, there is this dialectic relationship that they are interconnected and they're interdependent. So we really are all in this together. I reference Itzen, Lomas, Hefferson and Worth there, that those 4 people, amongst other things, are responsible for facilitating the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, both at the University of East London and America. And in one of their textbooks, they reckon, they mention about the second wave positive psychology, embracing the dark side of life. And in that book, there's this kind of pretty wonderful aspect around the dialectic reference that I made earlier. And here they say that the attention of opposition between 2 interacting forces or elements. And when we think about that, you know, this is like this mysterious way in which binary opposites, positive and negative, light and dark, up and down, whilst yes being diametrically opposed, are yet intimately connected and dependent on each other for their very existence. You can't really have one without the other. So in this context, PERMAH, character strengths, positive psychology, is a nuanced approach to take perhaps what Aristotle used to refer to as the golden mean. It's sort of getting a balance of view, an approach and recognition of an integration. We can also think about the yin and yang of Taoism. You know, here we've got Tao that's interacting and interconnected with the yin, which is the negative and passive, and the yang, the positive and active. And again, it's this interrelationship between the 2. Diametrically opposed, yes, but certainly interrelated and interconnected. So to contextualize that, insofar as the PERMAH model and the character strengths, yes, it is about focusing on positive, it's strengths-based, but it doesn't mean that that's all it is. It's also addressing areas of concern. And there's been some very recent developments in this work. There's a little bit of research work that's been done. I mean, there's a huge increase in the publications related to sort of positive psychology and positive psychology interventions. There's a seminal paper that Nemec published, and the details are up there. And that's a very inspiring paper. Yeah, as I say, it's a seminal paper. Wagner et al., they recently published reference to character strengths and PERMAH, and they were investigating the relationship of character strengths with the dimensional framework of well-being. And it's absolutely fascinating. They found that there were correlations between specific character strengths, and if you'll remember, there's 24, and they were able to demonstrate and certainly suggest in this research that these particular and specific character strengths were relevant and correlated to some of the specific dimensions of the PERMAH model. Some were also considered to have a positive influence on more than one of the dimensions of the PERMAH model, but also, as I mentioned, significantly, they were also considered to increase specific dimensions. Okay, I'm just going to do a time check. We're kind of around about 40 minutes, so I've probably got about sort of 5 or 10 minutes left to meet the 45-minute timeline. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to this particular practice, and then I'd actually invite us to participate together. This is referred to as a character strengths breathing space, and it's kind of related a little bit to the practice that Dean Donalds did last week when he was doing a webinar on mindfulness. He used the breathing space meditation that originates from the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy program. This practice integrates 3 specific character strengths with a mindfulness practice. So I'm going to move this slide for now, and then I'd like to invite you to undertake this practice. Okay, so this practice is an exercise. It's a 3-phased practice, and the first phase, oh, by the way, it probably lasts about 3 or 4 minutes. And this practice commences with curiosity. So in order to sort of set ourselves up and to sort of ground ourselves, sit in a way and adjust your posture so that you're in a position of, as Dean mentioned last week, dignity and strength. Perhaps place the soles of your feet so that they're in contact with the floor. And place your hands either on your lap or on your thighs. But the most important is that you're in a comfortable and alert position. For some of you, I would invite you, if it's comfortable, you can either close your eyes or lower your gaze. If you're comfortable, you can, if you're not, leave them open. And starting with the first character strength of this practice is I'd like you to kind of ask yourself, what's going on with me just right now? What thoughts are you having? What feelings are you having? What emotions? What bodily sensations might you be having? Are there any tingles? Any cold spots? Any hot spots? And ask yourself what is going on. And what we're doing is we're being curious. We're using the character strength of curiosity. Is there a storm going on in my body right now? Or is it calm? And if you find yourself getting caught up in any particular bodily sensation, thought, emotion, just ask yourself, what else? What else can I be curious about? What is going on just right now? And you could expand it out even to sounds. What sounds are going on just right now? And now shifting to the second phase of this practice, I'd like you to shift your attention to just one thing, your breathing. So shift your attention to your in-breath and your out-breath. Really focus your attention on the in-breath and the out-breath. And whilst we try to do this, it's not unusual for your mind to wander onto other thoughts, other feelings, other sensations. It's just what minds do, and that's okay. But now using the character strength of self-regulation is when you notice your mind has wandered wherever it's gone, bring it back to the breath. Take control. You're in control. So when your mind wanders to maybe, God, how long is this going to go on for? Or wonder what's for dinner tonight, or you're thinking about the meeting you've just come from, or the next meeting you're going to. Notice, but then using self-regulation, use your attention and focus of attention back on the breath. The in-breath and the out-breath. And now the last and final stage of this practice, the third step, is to now really shift your attention to the whole of your body just as it is, sitting here just right now. You're taking a step back, using the character strength of perspective. You're taking a view of your whole body, your mind, and the interconnectedness with your body. In this room that you're in just right now, you're taking a perspective. You're taking a wider view. Okay. Thank you. Let's rejoin together. And I'd just like to thank you. We're just about on time. So thank you for being present during this short presentation. And if you do want further information, do please contact me or Studio 3.